Just before 1 a.m. on October 25th, 1942, a piece of paper was placed on a table in front of General Harukichi Hyakutake. He read it, said nothing, then picked up a pen. The message he sent to Rabaul contained one sentence. At approximately 11 p.m. the previous evening, the right flank had captured Henderson Field. Within minutes, the entire Japanese Eighth Fleet began to move. Cruisers, destroyers, landing ships, all of them pushing toward the island to support the victorious forces ashore. At the same time, a few miles south of Hyakutake's command post, a man was standing in the mud, no boots, both hands burned raw, eyes red from 3 days without sleep. In front of him was a narrow rise in the jungle. And in front of that rise was something no military manual had a protocol for, a wall of Japanese bodies stacked chest high, blocking the line of fire from both machine guns. He stepped out of the fighting hole, pushed the bodies over with his bare hands, stepped back in, kept firing. Hyakutake's message said Henderson Field had fallen. The man who was supposed to let that happen hadn't gotten the memo. His name was John Basilone, Sergeant, 7th Marines, 6th son of an Italian immigrant tailor from New Jersey. Never finished school. Nobody in the Japanese chain of command knew his name. He wasn't in any of the operational orders. He was just a point on a defensive line that needed a body standing in it. This is the story of the longest night on Guadalcanal, about a Japanese general so certain of victory he announced it before it happened, and about the man his entire plan ran into and broke against. To understand why Hyakutake was that certain, you need to look at what he did before the attack even started. He called his staff together and told them to draft the formal procedures for accepting the American surrender. The protocol, the ceremony, every detail. His exact words on October 22nd were recorded. The time of the decisive battle between Japan and the United States has come. He was so confident of the outcome that he had the surrender preparations completed before a single shot was fired. That wasn't arrogance without foundation. The 2nd Sendai Division had fought across China, Malaya, Singapore, and Java. Every time they were handed an objective, that objective fell. No exceptions. And now Hyakutake had 7,000 of them, personally leading the operation from the island himself. His men boarded ship with 10 days of rations. No more. An officer explained to anyone who asked, they wouldn't need more. The campaign would be over before the food ran out. Nobody argued. 10 days was more than enough for the Sendai Division. Not one of those 7,000 men understood that 10 days wouldn't be enough. Not because the campaign would run long, but because they would never reach Henderson Field on schedule. To hit Henderson Field from the south, the direction least defended, the division needed to move 15 miles through roadless jungle. On October 12th, engineers started cutting by hand, axes, saws, machetes, no machinery, no vehicles, just men clearing a path, one stroke at a time through the densest terrain on Guadalcanal. After 10 days, they had what became known as the Maruyama Road. 15 miles, across 7 rivers, over ridgelines with no footing, through valleys of knee-deep mud, through forest so thick that daylight never reached the ground. On October 16th, the division began to march. Every man carried his pack, his rifle, his ammunition, and, by direct order, an artillery shell. The heavy weapons crews hauled disassembled gun parts on their backs. Cooking fires were forbidden. Noise was forbidden. They moved in complete silence, single file, through the jungle. Day 1, no problems. Day 2, the heavy weapons crews started falling behind. Day 3, artillery shells began appearing along the sides of the trail, then mortar rounds, then food rations. Nobody had ordered anyone to drop them. People dropped them because they had nothing left to carry them with. On the fourth day, Sergeant Hara stopped in the middle of the trail and opened his ration bag. He counted what was left. 2 days of food. He looked ahead. The jungle continued. No airfield, no open sky. He looked back down the length of the Maruyama Road. Artillery shells, mortar rounds, food tins, half submerged in the mud. He didn't record what he felt. He only recorded the fact. 2 days of food left, and the airfield was nowhere in sight. On the evening of October 21st, it became clear to Maruyama that his forces would not reach their positions in time. He put his men on half rations and postponed the attack to the 23rd. There was a problem with that decision. Sumiyoshi's force on the northern flank, responsible for the diversionary attack, never received word of the delay. At dusk on October 23rd, Sumiyoshi's infantry and 9 tanks attacked the Marine line at the Matanikau River right on schedule. American artillery destroyed every tank. The infantry was thrown back with heavy losses. Maruyama's main force was still struggling through the jungle. He postponed again. October 24th. Each delay was another day without fires, without hot food, without anything but the sound of 7,000 men slowly coming apart. But not one officer in the Sendai Division asked whether the plan should be reconsidered. They had come too far. The surrender protocol was already written. The victory signal had already been chosen. Failure was not in the script. On the evening of the 24th, Sergeant Hara opened his ration bag one last time. Enough for one day. He looked up through the canopy. No moon, complete dark. Somewhere ahead, through more jungle, was Henderson Field. Tonight had to be the last night. John Basilone was born in 1916 in Buffalo, New York. 6th of 10 kids. Father was a tailor. The house in Raritan, New Jersey, was crowded and never had much extra money. Nothing about the family suggested anything that would end up in a history book. Basilone left school before high school, not because he was lazy, because the family needed him working. He caddied at a local golf course, carried bags for men who had things he didn't, took the tips, brought the money home. At 17, he joined the Army. Not for idealism, not for adventure. 3 meals a day and a steady paycheck. The Army sent him to the Philippines, 3 years in Manila. He learned enough Tagalog to hold real conversations. He learned cards well enough to win consistently. And he learned to field strip a Browning M1917 heavy machine gun in complete darkness, not because anyone required it, but because the machine had its own logic, and once he understood that logic, he could make it work under any conditions. His buddies called him Manila John. Not because he was a great fighter, because he wouldn't stop talking about the Philippines. In 1940, he transferred to the Marines. By the evening of October 24th, 1942, Sergeant Basilone had positioned 2 M1917 Browning heavy machine guns on a narrow rise along the Henderson Field defensive perimeter under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller. The Browning was a water-cooled heavy machine gun, over 40 pounds without ammunition, 250-round belt. When the water in the cooling jacket ran out after sustained fire, Marines used whatever liquid was available. That night, more than once, they urinated into the water jackets to keep the guns from seizing up. Basilone knew the weapon the way a mechanic knows an engine, where it failed under pressure, how to fix each failure in the dark, what it could do and what it couldn't. He looked out at the tree line. Nothing visible. He turned and looked at his 16 men. Some of them were shaking, not from cold. Guadalcanal was never cold, but the kind of shaking that happens when a person knows something is coming and doesn't know exactly what. He didn't say much. Just one thing. Let them get close. 30 yards. Nobody fires before that. 30 yards. Close enough to see faces in the dark. Close enough that nothing in the field of fire between his guns and the tree line would be walking back into the jungle. He sat down, leaned against the side of the fighting hole, waited. In the jungle to the south, 7,000 Sendai soldiers were moving through the dark. Total silence. No voices, no fires, nothing but the sound of boots on wet leaves and the breathing of men who had walked 15 miles through hell and still hadn't stopped. They knew Americans were waiting somewhere ahead. They didn't know who. Around 8 p.m., artillery opened up from the west. Pistol Pete, the Japanese gun the Americans had been hunting for weeks without ever finding, started dropping rounds into the Henderson Field perimeter. From the north, Sumiyoshi's surviving forces joined in with mortars. The western and northern sky lit up in pulses. In their fighting holes, Marines ducked and waited. Nobody was counting what number night of shelling this was anymore. Basilone didn't duck. He sat on the edge of his hole and looked south. The fire was coming from the west and north. Nothing from the south, no movement from the tree line in front of his position. He'd been on Guadalcanal long enough to know what that meant. When the Japanese made noise in one direction, it was usually because they didn't want you looking at another. He checked his ammunition belts one more time. Then he waited. At 1:15 in the morning there was no warning, no sound before it, no voices, no equipment rattling against branches. Just darkness. And then the darkness started moving. The 9th Company of Nasu's 3rd Battalion came out of the tree line, fast and low, weapons ready in the formations they had drilled hundreds of times. These were soldiers who had been fighting for 2 years. They knew how to move at night. They knew how to take a fixed position. They had done it everywhere they had ever fought, and the result had always been the same. They moved toward Basilone's position. 20 yards, 25, 30 yards. Basilone opened fire. Both Brownings fired at once. In the tight space of a tropical night, the sound didn't register as gunfire anymore. It was more like tearing, continuous, and even, no pause, no break. The first soldier went down before he understood what was happening. The second fell on top of the first. The third tried to shift direction, but there was nowhere to go. Both guns were set at crossing angles, covering every inch of open ground between the tree line and the rise. No direction to run, no place to drop and survive. Within 5 minutes, the 9th Company ceased to exist as a fighting unit. A second wave came out of the tree line. They stepped over the bodies of the first wave without slowing down. They had been trained since their first day in uniform that enough men moving fast enough would break the enemy's nerve before the ammunition ran out. It had worked every time they had ever tried it. 30 yards. Basilone fired. A third wave. Stepping over the second. 30 yards. Fired. Then more. Basilone stopped counting. He just fired, checked the belt, called for the next one, fired again, both hands moving on pure muscle memory. No thought, no hesitation, just doing what he had practiced 10,000 times. Somewhere in the middle of the night, one of the 2 Brownings went silent. Basilone looked over. The right gun, down. The Marine on it was working the action in the dark, hands shaking, couldn't find the jam. He looked at the tree line. The Japanese were still coming. In seconds, they would identify the gap. He didn't call for anyone, didn't wait for orders. He picked up a spare Browning and its mount, 90 pounds of gun and steel, put it on his shoulder, and ran. Not in a straight line, because a straight line crossed ground where Japanese soldiers were already filtering through gaps in the perimeter. He cut low and wide. Twice he ran into Japanese soldiers working through the gaps. Twice he used his Colt point 4.5 without breaking stride. He reached the silent position, fixed the jammed gun in the dark, hands moving from memory, locating the feed problem, clearing it, cycling the action, chambering around. The gun fired again. Under 2 minutes, start to finish. The Marine on the other gun said afterward that he hadn't looked toward the silent position the whole time Basilone was gone. He was afraid of what he'd see. He just kept his eyes forward and kept firing. Around 3 a.m., the last belt went into the gun. Basilone looked back toward the ammo point, 150 yards behind his position, looked at the tree line. Still movement. He told the man nearest him to keep firing. Then he ran back through the dark, picked up belts, and ran back toward the sound of his own guns. He loaded, kept firing. He described it afterward in one sentence. "I guess I went about 150 yards to get the ammunition, and when I got back, we kept on firing all night." That was his complete account of something other people would spend decades writing books about. Nobody knows exactly when Basilone lost his asbestos gloves. By the time he noticed, he had already grabbed the barrel of the Browning with his bare hands to reposition the gun as the Japanese shifted their angle of approach. The barrel had been firing for hours. The metal smoked when it touched moisture. His right hand blistered immediately. His left hand followed. He didn't let go, not because it didn't hurt, because letting go meant something he understood better than anyone else on that rise. Around 3 a.m., Basilone looked out from his fighting hole and stopped. Not because the guns were empty, not because the Japanese had pulled back, because what he saw had blocked both guns' fields of fire. The bodies had piled up. Wave after wave, hour after hour, hundreds of men falling at the same distance in the same direction, stacking on top of each other. The pile was chest-high, high enough that both Brownings were now looking at a wall of dead instead of at the tree line. Basilone climbed out of the fighting hole. He stood in the open in the middle of the night, under continuing artillery fire from the west, in the tropical rain that had started falling sometime in the last hour, and pushed the bodies over with his burned hands. The Marines still standing did the same. When the field of fire was clear, Basilone stepped back into the hole, kept firing. At that same moment, while Basilone was standing outside his hole pushing bodies, a piece of paper was placed on the table in front of General Hyakutake. Report from the right flank. Henderson Field had been captured. Hyakutake didn't verify it. He picked up his pen. The fleet moved. Inside his command tent, Maruyama stood listening to the guns from the south. They weren't getting quieter. They were getting louder. If Henderson Field had fallen, if the Americans were breaking, the fire coming from that direction should have been fading. Instead, it was steady and mechanical. Not the sound of a line collapsing, but the sound of something that had no intention of stopping. He stared at the field telephone on the table, waited. At 4 a.m. it rang. A voice from the other end, quiet and uncertain. The report of capturing the airfield was a mistake. A unit had crossed an open clearing in the jungle and mistaken it for the runway. They hadn't reached the objective. They didn't know where they were. Maruyama set the phone down. Outside, the guns from the south were still firing, steady as a machine. A staff officer who was in the tent that night wrote after the war, "When I heard that, I felt a sense of foreboding come over me." At 4:30 a.m., Hyakutake recalled the victory message. The fleet had been underway for hours. At dawn on October 25th, pilots of the Cactus Air Force climbed into their planes at Henderson Field. The airfield that Hyakutake had reported captured was operating normally, runway intact, planes fueled. They took off and flew out over the water toward the Japanese fleet still moving in to support forces that had supposedly taken the field. The fleet didn't expect American aircraft. The cruiser Yura was sunk. Several other ships were badly damaged. The fleet turned back. Maruyama didn't quit immediately. On the night of October 25th, he ordered a second attack with what remained of his division. Those soldiers climbed back out of the jungle in the dark. Many hadn't eaten in 2 days. Many had been fighting since the night before. They stood up and walked back into the trees because that was what they had been trained to do. The result was the same as the night before. By dawn on the 26th, Maruyama wrote his report to Hyakutake in the clipped language of a Japanese officer. No word for failure, no complaints, just short, precise sentences. The line could not be penetrated. Requesting permission to withdraw. Hyakutake gave the order. 7,000 Sendai soldiers turned around and walked back down the Maruyama road. They passed the things they had left on the way in: artillery shells, mortar rounds, food tins, half submerged in the mud after days of rain. Nobody spoke. The wounded were carried. The exhausted were helped along. Of the 30,000 Japanese troops deployed to Guadalcanal, 1/3 died in combat. Another third died from malaria, dysentery, and starvation. The soldiers who came back called the island Jigoku no Shima, Hell Island. Word spread through Japanese units across the Pacific that Guadalcanal was a place men went to die. For the first time in the war, Japanese soldiers told each other they were afraid of a specific place on a map. In December 1942, a closed meeting took place at the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. Japan's senior generals and admirals sat before Emperor Hirohito. No reporters, no public record. What was said wasn't known until classified documents were released after the war. The conclusion: Guadalcanal could not be held. It was the first time in the entire war that Japan formally decided to abandon a position it had taken. Nobody in that room used the word failure. They used phrases like strategic reallocation and adjustment of defensive lines. But everyone present knew what those words actually meant. Guadalcanal was the high-water mark of the Japanese Empire. From that point forward, not one additional meter of territory would be taken. Only retreat, slowly at first, then faster, then not fast enough. In February 1943, Japanese destroyers moved quietly toward the shore in the dark. 11,000 soldiers boarded in silence. No ceremony, no speeches, no music. They left Guadalcanal the way people leave a place they want to forget, quickly, without looking back. American reconnaissance aircraft found the empty beaches 3 days after the evacuation ended. Empty trenches, abandoned equipment scattered across the sand, the jungle already beginning to reclaim what had been fighting positions a week before. Guadalcanal ended not with a surrender or a final battle. It ended with silence. After the war, Japanese officers who survived wrote their memoirs. People read those books looking for answers to a question military historians had been asking for decades. Why did the Sendai Division, a unit that had never lost, fail on a small island in the South Pacific? The memoirs offered many explanations: terrain, logistics, communication failures, disease, the false report, the delays. Not one of them mentioned the name John Basilone. Not because they were hiding something, because they didn't know his name. All they knew was that there was a point on the southern perimeter of Henderson Field that could not be broken. No matter how many times they hit it, no matter how many men, no matter which wave, a point that held while everything around it might have given way. Their training had no framework for what had stopped them. At 4:30 in the morning on October 25th, Hyakutake recalled his victory message. Too late to stop the fleet. Too late to change anything. A few months later, John Basilone was asked to accept the Medal of Honor. He turned down the offer to have President Roosevelt presented in Washington. He wanted the ceremony in the field with his unit. He received it on May 21, 1943, in Australia. When reporters asked him what he wanted to say, he said, "Only part of this medal belongs to me. Pieces of it belong to the boys who are still on Guadalcanal." After the ceremony, the Marine Corps offered him a commission and a desk job in Washington for the rest of the war. He turned it down. He applied to go back to the Pacific. Denied. Applied again. Denied again. The third time, he wrote, "I'm just a plain soldier and I want to stay one. I'm not an officer and I'm not a museum piece. My place is with my outfit." That time, they let him go. On February 19, 1945, Basilone landed on Iwo Jima in the first wave. Within hours, he had destroyed a Japanese blockhouse with grenades and demolitions and guided a tank trapped in a minefield to safety under direct fire. He was killed by a mortar round that morning, 28 years old. The legend of the invincible Japanese infantry, the force that had rolled through Southeast Asia in under a year, the division that had never lost, didn't end because of a brilliant Allied strategy. It didn't end because of American industrial power or a naval battle or a decision made in some office in Washington. It ended on a narrow rise of ground in the jungle of Guadalcanal, in the rain, in the dark, in front of a man whose name nobody on the other side ever learned. The sixth son of an Italian immigrant tailor, left school before high school, standing barefoot in the mud with two burned hands and no intention of going anywhere.